Alright, welcome back. So far, we've covered the attack phases, the offense that you have at your disposal, the managing of spells, and blocking. The last major consideration in combat is allotting the damage that you take from anything that gets through your blocks, either to yourself, your units, or both. In our first episode, we discussed the basic mechanic for taking damage in an effort to explain the rationale for some of the core mechanics. We'll now take a moment to rehash that discussion a little bit, get our heads wrapped around the damage mechanic once again, and then we'll take a look at a few of the finer points of what I will go to my grave arguing should have been called the owie phase. Then we'll spread our wings and really fly with a discussion of unit wounding. And at that point, just like that, you'll have finished your torturous journey through my main combat videos and have the emotional scars to prove it. The truly doughty amongst you can look forward to additional videos in this series past this one, with my next installment planned to be one covering how you group units together when attacking to increase your efficiency. Most likely following that is going to be a combat demo video in which all this stuff is going to be brought together in one big bloody mess. So with all that said, let's get started. As a quick reminder to sort of set the stage for what's to follow, remember that for each attack that comes at you, you may be able to reduce its damage rating and/or, of course, you might be able to block it. If you do successfully block it, then none of its attendant effects will impact you in any way. If you fail to block it, however, even if it's only a single point of damage that's coming through, then any and all attendant effects will hit you as well. Each attack must be dealt with separately, forcing inefficient use potentially of your block points, and of course each attack also deals damage separately, potentially resulting in more damage than you would take if the attacks from multiple sources could be combined. The reason for this is that when you take damage, you take a number of wound cards into your hand. Remember, of course, there are no hit points in Mage Knight, and you cannot be killed, but enough wound cards added to your hand can mean that the game is effectively all but over. The number of wound cards you take is going to be a function of how many times your armor number is met or partially met by the damage points that are coming in. You can therefore think of your armor rating as indicating something like the size of your wound cup, and the damage coming in as some liquid nastiness that's then going to fill that cup possibly over and over again until the liquid runs out. If enough liquid comes in that it fills up one of these armor cups, the liquid then spills over, generating a wound, and begins filling up the next cup in the chain. The process repeats until the damage points for that attack eventually run out. The number of wounds you take in the end equals the number of times the cup was filled or partially filled. If more than one attack went unblocked, you then proceed to the next attack and the next until all attacks have been dealt with in this fashion. Mathematically, it's actually all very simple. What you do for each attack is just divide the damage by your armor rating and you round up. You do it again for the next attack and the next until you are done. Of course, if they were blocked, you don't need to worry about them. Let's take a look at a quick example. So imagine you're Tovak, because, why not? And imagine you've got an armor of 3. If you're hit and allow the attack to come through from something like this unit here with an attack of 3, and it's not going to make a difference if it's 1, 2, or 3 damage, you're going to take 1 wound. And the reason for that is, if we're using the cup metaphor, your cup size is 3. An attack of 1, 2, or 3 is going to fill or partially fill that cup one time, and therefore you're going to take 1 wound. Looked at mathematically, 1, 2, and 3 are all 1 when you divide by 3 and round up. If by contrast you're attacked by a unit doing 4 damage, then again, if your armor is 3, you're going to be taking a second wound, because that 4th point is spilling over out of that first cup into the second cup. Or again, if you're dividing 4 by 3 and rounding up, you're getting 2. And then, of course, if you're attacked by something like a werewolf that does 7 damage, and remember this swiftness effect here, the winged arrow, is going to double the point value of the attack for the difficulty of blocking it, but not for the damage it's doing. So if I let that through, and 14 is a lot to block, so there's a good chance I'm going to have to let that through, then when that hits me, it's doing 7 damage with an armor rating of 3. That's going to fill up 2 of my cups and spill over into a third, and it's going to deal 3 wounds to me. Again, 7 divided by 3 is going to be 2 and a fraction, rounded up to 3. So either way you're thinking of it, you're going to take 3 wounds. As a result, considering this mechanic, you have to bear in mind that an increase to your armor won't necessarily save you any damage at all unless the numbers work out. But then again, it could cut your damage in half. Say if you moved from a 3 to a 4. Say I gain a level here, and I now have a 4-point armor. Well, if I'm attacked by that same 4-point attack, which was dealing 2 wounds to me at 3, now it's only dealing 1. Then again, if I'm attacked by something that was a 2, it's not going to matter if my armor is 3 or 4. If I'm attacked by something with 3, it's not going to matter if my armor is 3 or 4. I'm going to be taking the same amount of damage. So it's not like an increase in damage always helps you, but sometimes it can cut your wounds in half. So it's a little swingy, but it does overall make a big difference. Remember again that wounds don't actually do anything really except clog up your hand, because they can't normally be played even sideways, although there are ways around that. But they do count against your hand size limit. So wounds therefore can't kill you, of course, but they can sometimes render you really, really freaking useless for several turns in a game where speed and efficiency is king. And that's a death of sorts, albeit one accompanied by perhaps a little less fanfare. Just about the most decisively bad thing that can happen to you then in Mage Knight is something called a knockout. If you've seen the first video in the series, and I think again maybe in the last one, then you know a little bit about this already, but also unfortunately I got something slightly wrong there, so I want to pause here for a moment to say my bad first of all, and offer the following correct account of a knockout by way of correction. A knockout takes place whenever, and this is true however it happens, but only as a result of the combat in question. You, as a result of that combat, add a number of wounds into your hand equal to or exceeding your hand size limit, which of course is shown on your current level token. So in this case, 5. If I'm level 1 or 2, I've got a hand size of 5. If I take 5 wounds in a single combat, not necessarily from a single enemy, but in the course of a single combat, for whatever reason, during the course of that combat, I take 5 wounds, I'm hit with a knockout. Importantly, this definition is carefully worded to specify that wounds already in your hand at the start of combat do not count towards a knockout from that combat. So it is entirely possible in the middle of a combat to have a number of wounds in your hand that is greater than your hand limit and still not be knocked out. It still sucks, but you're not necessarily going to be knocked out by it. Just as importantly, against multiple enemies, you're getting attacked multiple times, and what wound cards do count towards a knockout are any that get added to your hand during the entire combat against all enemies, and actually for any reason. So this actually is going to include wound cards which, for just one example, you might have inflicted upon yourself by playing something like the Blood Rage card. Basically, if you add a total number of wound cards across the duration of the combat equal to your hand size limit, you are knocked out. Okay, but what does that mean? And this is where I made a bit of a boo-boo in the other videos, because I had it in my head that combat ends immediately when you're knocked out, and that's actually not the case. What does happen is you are forced to immediately discard any non-wound cards that are left in your hand. If you didn't have any left, technically the knockout doesn't even affect you. Though, of course, you're still going to have way too many wounds in your hand for that to be too much of a consolation. This is the only effect of the knockout, actually. If you have any cards left in your hand that aren't wounds, you have to discard them. Combat then continues after you do that discarding. So you've thrown away your, not thrown away, you've discarded your remaining non-wound deed cards. And this then means a couple of things. Firstly, the label knockout notwithstanding, you yourself can still take part in the combat. Because you can still go on to not only activate units to fight for you, but actually you can, oddly enough, you can still activate your skills as well if you have any. That is, after being knocked out, if Tovak has cold swordsmanship or sharpshooting or shield mastery, he can still play these in combat after getting knocked out. He could do this to take down his enemy, win the fight, and claim a tower. Again, despite having been knocked out. So you could see why I might have maybe misremembered this rule when filming episode 1. And for some reason, again, got it in my head that combat was finished when you were knocked out. But regardless, it is in fact true that combat does not end when you're knocked out. And in fact, you can continue to fight yourself. You simply lose your non-wound deed cards, if indeed you had any left, which you might not have. Now, all that said, it's not necessarily all unicorns and rainbows here, because if you take knockout damage in the wrong fight, well, you might have very well wanted combat to end. After all, you most likely took all this damage in the middle phases of the fight when the enemy is attacking, and if the enemies aren't done attacking, well, you're more than likely going to be taking even more wounds into your hand than you already have done. And, you know, that's just a really bad day at the office. Central, of course, to figuring out how badly an incoming attack is going to wound you is the damage rating of the attack. Now, this is generally read straight off the token, and there's really not a lot to it, as elemental qualities and the like are going to affect block, but never have any bearing on damage, at least for you. If you possibly manage to reduce the attack rating, even if you did so via a card played in an earlier phase, perhaps as a result of something you did in the attack phase, it said that an attack was reduced, that's going to carry through. It's going to stay reduced into the damage phase. And the damage done by the attack is going to be reduced when you're figuring damage. So if you had an effect that reduced attack by 2, this would be a 4, this would be a 4, this would be a 3, but you're still just reading that number, adjusting it, and then playing accordingly. There are, however, a pair of attack qualities that will impact the number of wounds that you take when a hit comes in. So we're going to have to cover those before we move on. The first of these qualities is the brutal quality. A brutal attack is going to double the attack rating of an attack, but only does so when figuring damage. If you manage to reduce the attack value, you do this first, and then you double the lowered rating when you consider brutality and how much damage it's going to do. Once you've done so, you figure then the damage normally, just as though whatever number you wind up with after any reducing and doubling and all of that is done, you consider the damage that you're taking just as though that number was what was originally on the token in the first place. So in the case of something like this Minotaur, should I have that attack coming through and hitting me, it's normally rated at a 5. I'm going to have to generate 5 points of block in order to stop it. But if I let that through and I'm now in the damage phase, I'm going to treat that number as though it was a 10 because of this brutality icon here. So I'm going to really have a good reason to try to block that attack rather than let it through and hit me, because 10's a lot of damage to take. Similarly, with this 6, doesn't matter that it's fire damage. That matters for whether or not I'm going to be able to block it. But as far as damage is concerned, because of the brutality, it's doing 12 points of damage. Same thing here. Cold fire versus fire doesn't matter for me. It's doing 12 points of damage. Again, if I have any damage reducing effects, let's imagine these are reduced by 2, then this first attack is going to be treated as though it was a 3. Should I fail to block it, that 3 is what now is doubled, and I'm going to take 6 points of damage. Here, if I'm reducing either of these by 2, I'm doubling that 4 and taking 8. Poison attacks, in contrast to brutal attacks, do not alter the damage rating in any way, nor do they actually impact the number of wounds that you are going to take into your hand when you get hit. Instead, when you're hit with a poison attack, you treat it just like any other attack, right up until the very, very last step. You therefore determine the number of wounds you need to take into your hand exactly as you normally would, and you proceed to take those wounds into your hand just as with any other attack. There is literally no change to the process thus far. However, the poison does add an extra little wrinkle just before you move on from your resolution of the attack. And it's frankly a doozy. You must now also place a number of wound cards into your discard pile equal to the wound cards you just put into your hand, effectively doubling the number of wounds that the attack is going to give you overall, if somewhat mercifully delaying the impact of the additional wounds for a little bit. Now, these additional wound cards, because they are not added directly to your hand, do not count towards a knockout, and they will not immediately cripple you the way that a mess of brutal wounds will, by coming in a great big lump into your hand all at once, and thereby preventing you from drawing additional cards, etc. However, they will come back at you next round, and even though it's probably not going to happen all at once, that can happen, and you'll unfortunately never know when they're going to come at you. These poison wounds, when you first take them, are also harder to get rid of after combat ends, because the healing that you get from deed cards, units, interactions in villages, and the like all only affect wounds in your hand or on your units. These sources of healing cannot be used to clear wounds from your discard pile. Only glades can remove such wounds, and that of course requires you to find and get onto a glade and then wait a while for it to slowly chip away at any pile of wounds you happen to have in your discard pile. This is often not the best way to go because it just takes way too much time for you to be successful in the game overall. As a result, after you take poison damage, you usually wind up having to wait until they decide to show up again in your hand in a subsequent round, and then just kind of cross your fingers that at that time some kind of healing is available to you at that exact moment. None of this is really all that great. Okay, so let's just take a look at a couple of quick examples. Suppose I'm fighting this hag here, and suppose that attack gets through for whatever reason, and I'm then hit by 3. If my armor rating, as it is currently, is 2, then of course I would calculate this just as normal, and I would take 2 wounds into my hand, like so. Okay. But because it's also a poison attack, I am going to have to take 2 wound cards as well into my discard pile. So I'm going to be effectively taking 4 wounds, which is rather nasty for just a 3-point attack. This is marginally better if I happen to have a slightly higher armor rating. Suppose my armor rating was, in fact, 3. Then she's only going to be doing 1 wound to me, but that 1 wound, again, is going to have its mirror added to my discard pile, so I'm effectively going to be taking 2. Similarly, for these hags, if they hit me for 5 and my armor is 3, again, I'm going to be taking 2 wounds, and 2 are going to be going to my discard pile. Right? Now, you can also have, unfortunately, an enemy such as this, which not only has cold fire, which makes it hard to block. It's only 4 points, but it's cold fire, so it's hard to block. On top of that, if you do let it through, because it's hard to block, it's going to do 8 damage to you because it's brutal. That means that if I let this guy hit me, I'm taking not 2 wounds, but 3 wounds, because it's doing 8 points of damage. And I only have 3 points of armor in this scenario. And, of course, 3 mirrored wounds are going into my discard pile, because in addition to being brutal, it's poison. These guys are kind of nasty. This, of course, is much less of a big deal during the final round of a game, because wounds in your discard pile will usually not be coming back at you any longer by that point. After all, you're not going to reshuffle your D-deck, so unless you have a tactic or something that is pulling cards out of your discard pile, it actually doesn't matter for your effectiveness, at least, that they're there. But before you get too cavalier about poison damage, even in the end game, remember that the final victory point tally does count all of your wounds against you, and they can add up fast. You might win a fight, gaining fame for the victory, but losing fame overall in the final analysis, when the cost of that victory is a poison attack throwing 2 or 3 wounds into your hand and another 2 or 3 into your pile. Not too many foes are worth 8 or 12 fame in exchange. So in the end, what poison does is it kind of sort of doubles the damage of an attack, and in fact does this even more purely than does a brutal attack. After all, consider that a doubled attack rating may not mean twice the wounds. For instance, if you're hit for 5 and when your armor is 4, that's 2 wounds. But making it brutal turns the 5 damage into 10, and that's only going to be 3 wounds and not 4. By contrast, if you make it poison instead, you take 2 in hand and 2 into the discard. That's 4 wounds, not 3. But you at least do have the small comfort of knowing that the extra wounds from poison aren't, at least initially, clogging your hand. And that right there is pretty much all you need to know about getting wounded. Yourself, at least. Nothing else in the base game or Lost Legion will change the number of wounds that you take from incoming damage. That said, before we move on to consider the meat shields that are your units, there is one more thing that you need to worry about when you get hit. There are a small number of units in the game that have this little statue icon on them in the attack quality spot. This indicates that these are units that paralyze you. I guess the iconography here is meant to recall Medusa or maybe a basilisk petrification effect. Even though it's not called petrification, it's called paralysis, and even though, for you at least, it's not fatal, but I guess they didn't want to put something offensive like somebody in a wheelchair on the token, so they went with the petrify image, and of course that's fitting for a Medusa or for somebody like this freezer, who I guess is encasing you in ice or something like that. Having covered the knockout this effect is actually pretty easy to describe. It basically knocks you out, regardless of the number of wounds that you've taken in the fight or your hand size limit. That is, while it doesn't end combat, doesn't stop you from using skills or any of that, it doesn't stop you from using units, doesn't add any extra wounds on top of any damage that you otherwise would have taken from the attack, considering brutal and swift and poison and all of that. What paralysis does do is immediately force you to discard any and all non-wound cards in your hand the moment you personally are hit by an attack of this nature, and take even a single wound to your hand as a result. That's all it does. It's simple, but it can be nasty. After all, you usually have a bunch of offense in your hand waiting to get played in the attack phase, and that means the last thing you want, of course, is to discard them now. Of course, it can happen that you get a handful of ranged move or block cards, and you've kind of thrown them all down already. Took a hit from one of these attacks and really actually suffered no ill effects from it whatsoever because you've used up all your cards. But this is going to be a pretty rare circumstance. Paralysis is just generally pretty bad. It's going to be something that you usually are going to desperately want to block or forestall somehow, like 95% of the time. And in fact, it's even worse for your units than it is for you. So let's take a look then at how units can be used to take some of the heat off you in a tight spot, and we'll circle around to how paralysis and the like affects them. It's a little bit different from how it hurts you. Alright, so here's a spot of good news in all of this bleak and bloody business of getting smacked around by hydras and dragons and the like. Your soldiers can be commanded to stand between you and the things with teeth. They can take damage instead of you, and that's just lovely. Now, you can of course only assign damage to a unit when that unit is allowed and willing to participate in the combat in the first place. So usually what this means is you're on your own in dungeons or when burning down monasteries and the like, because your units don't go down into dungeons. They won't help you burn out religious orders. Some units like heroes and stuff you have to convince to come along with you to certain fights and so on and so forth. So there's a bunch of times when units will not be willing to participate in a combat, and of course if they're not there you can't assign damage to them. But outside of that, even if a unit is spent, meaning it's been used and cannot be used again until it's ready to refreshed, so maybe we've already used the attack of both of these guys, well I guess we would have had to use the block of these guys, but maybe we've done the siege on the catapults, maybe the guardsmen were used in a prior combat, doesn't really matter. Even if they're both spent, it can still take wounds for you. Not only that, but wounds do not prevent a unit from readying, though a wounded unit still cannot be activated, and they do not prevent a unit from being disbanded or replaced by another unit. These are both very important facts. We'll come back to this. But just as a for instance, you can assault a city, let a unit take damage for you, then just ride in and recruit a replacement, and, wahoo. Sorry, guardsmen. Thanks for taking a bullet for me and all, but these mages here are like way cooler than you, so they're my new friends. See ya. Have fun bleeding. Okay, so how does one actually do this? Well, whenever an attack goes unblocked, it is going to damage something on your side. The first thing you have to do is decide if you want to send a unit to take that damage, or if you're going to go ahead and take that damage yourself. Again, you can only decide to have a unit take the damage if that unit is allowed to participate in the combat, and if that unit is not already wounded. I tend to think of wounded units as like out of action and not participating anyway, so it's not that hard to keep this straight. The attack then that's coming in will have a rating associated with it, of course, with its damage. This might have been reduced by something that you did and or doubled by brutal, etc., just as we've been discussing. But whatever the number is that is coming in as damage, if you then send that damage to at least a typical unit, we're going to put resistance and stuff to the side, then you're going to find the armor rating on that unit card. In this case, both of these have an armor rating of 4. And once you find that armor rating, then you're going to deduct this number from the damage value of the attack in question. And then you're going to wound the unit by placing a wound card on top of it that kind of winds up covering it up. The unit has then soaked up some of the damage for you, and the attack is going to be reduced as if you had played in an attack reduction effect. And the reduction, of course, is equivalent to the armor of the unit that was just taking the wound for you. If the damage value of the attack is used up as a result of this, then you're done and you move on to the next attack or to the attack phase if all the attacks are done. If the damage value of the attack was not, however, exhausted, then any remaining value can then be passed on to another unit if you have any units remaining to take damage, or of course it can be taken by yourself in the usual fashion. So imagine that we are in the middle of a fight and we've got a werewolf like this guy here. He's swift and we weren't able to generate enough block to stop him. We're taking 7 damage. Maybe we just really need to keep ourselves unwounded. We've got to stay active. We need to draw cards for what's coming up. Therefore, we're left with a painful decision. We've got to go ahead and throw some wounds on our units. They've got to soak up the damage here. So if this werewolf here is hitting us, again, swiftness is not going to matter. He's doing 7 points of damage. I might therefore send the damage to the Utum Swordsman, and as a result that's going to reduce the damage from 7 down to 3 because he had an armor rating of 4. I can at that point choose to then send the remaining 3 points of damage to the catapult, and again it's kind of like the cup metaphor. Even a fraction of its armor value is used up in soaking up damage, it takes a wound. It's going to reduce that 3 remaining points by its 4 points of armor rating, reducing it down to 0, and there's no more damage left. Nothing's going to hit me. That attack is taken care of, although I've wounded 2 units in taking care of it. Alternatively, I could have instead decided to maybe send the first packet of damage to my guardsmen, but I really want to refresh and use those catapults. I do not want to lose them for any reason. So maybe I send damage to my Utum Swordsman, and then I decide to take the 3 remaining points and damage myself. And again, with an armor rating of 3, that means I'm just adding 1 point of damage to my hand. Either way, it's -4, and then what do you do with the 3 remaining? You can send it to a unit, you can take it yourself, and now it's just a packet of 3 that again you deal with using the same mechanics as anywhere else. Now remember that units can take damage whether they're activated or not, whether they've been used up or they've been spent or not. But once they've been wounded, while they can be refreshed, they can't then be spent again until they've been healed. You can't activate them or make use of them until they've been healed. So you might want to consider using, or rather you might want to consider wounding units that have already been used first. Finally, as a quick aside, in order to heal units, you're going to have to apply a number of healing points to the unit equal to its level in order to heal it for 1 wound. So a level 2 unit is healed only by 2 or more points of healing. Remember again that glades cannot be used on units. So units can therefore be somewhat expensive and difficult to heal, sometimes as expensive to heal as they are to simply replace. Before moving on, just to be painfully explicit, swiftness has no bearing on the damage of an attack, so it cannot in any way affect the damaging of units. Brutal, of course, doubles the damage rating of an attack, but the mechanics here of wounding units are not going to change. You're just altering the number of damage points that are coming in as a result of brutality. So you're just starting with a higher number. And that really right there is just the core of unit damage. But it wouldn't be Mage Knight without a few wrinkles. So let's have a look now at how these waters look with a little mud in the stream. You've probably noticed when looking over the unit selection in this game that some of them have resistance, as denoted pretty much exactly like it is on enemy tokens. And it's going to work against fire, ice, or physical attacks. You could be forgiven for thinking that because of this denotation it's going to work the same way, but alas, it does not. Remember, as we've said a few times now in this series, the underlying mechanics of units versus enemies, the mechanics are different. So resistance is going to, as a result, kind of have to work a little bit differently as well. After all, a fire-resistant enemy, like, say, this dragon here, is going to effectively be twice as hard to kill against a fire attack, or using a fire attack. And since enemies like this are all or nothing, that's going to be, of course, a huge benefit to them. If a unit, by contrast, simply doubled its armor value against an attack, well, that wouldn't save them from taking a wound at all, because in the normal progress of damaging units, they're going to take a wound the instant damage is sent their way, as long as it's more than 0 points of damage. So you double this person's 3 points of armor. It doesn't help them against a physical attack. They're going to take a wound either way. So the resistance really hasn't done anything for them vis-a-vis getting hurt. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to say they're resistant if the attacks are going to hurt them exactly the same way. Now, of course, when you're attacking enemies, you're not actually doubling their armor. You're instead halving your attack values. And again, you might think, well, maybe we're halving the enemy's attack values versus these units, but that actually, going down that path, then becomes very quickly convoluted and ugly as well, because, you know, think of it this way: what are you supposed to do? You're going to have the attack value when you apply it to this guy, but then unhalve it again when that damage then progresses to somebody else. And how do you know, it's just going to be really ugly really quick. So here's the way the system actually works, and I think you'll agree once we go through it that it's actually a much better way for all of this to go. When a unit takes damage from an attack against which it is resistant, instead of taking a wound and reducing the damage value by its armor, the way you normally would, because of the resistance, it's going to work a little bit differently. You can actually almost think of it as having two sets of armor, or maybe even almost its own buffer unit in front of it, protecting it. And only when the attack has gotten through that first layer of protection does the unit actually take damage, which then it does as normal. Mechanically, the attack is going to be reduced by the armor value of the resistant unit, and then the unit is going to take damage as normal if there is in fact any damage remaining after that initial reduction. And when I say as normal, this means that the second time through its armor, as it were, the damage of the attack is depleted yet further. If any damage still remains, it will then pass on to you or other units, but by then it will have been reduced by the armor value twice. If you like the cup metaphor we've been using for damage to you, consider it again here. Normally, units are like damage cups that fill once, but only once, and take a wound no matter how filled that cup gets. And then once filled, they overflow, and the overflow moves on to another target, possibly to you. When the unit is resistant, however, you could think of the unit as dipping that cup into the damage pool and just throwing the content away first. And then it gets filled up as normal, possibly still overflowing to hit other targets. The result of this system is that you can have units soak up damage from lesser attacks and actually not take wounds as a result of it. It can happen that you have, let's say, this fire attack here, the second of this unit's attacks does 2 points of fire damage. You could choose to send that to either the fire mages here or the Delphana Masters. And because they are resistant, that attack would not get through that initial reduction, and these units would not take any damage whatsoever. I'll show you an example of how all of this works in a little bit more detail in a second. But this is, of course, very handy. Any damage taken by a resistant unit is going to be reduced twice as much as normal before it's passed on to you. And again, there are going to be times when they don't actually even take any wounds at all, despite soaking up some damage for you. There is, however, one last thing to consider before we move on to, some detailed examples here. And it's because this is really easy to forget. And it's that a unit can only be assigned damage once per combat. This normally is actually not something that needs to be said, because taking damage, of course, is going to result in a wound, and therefore the inability to take more damage, because when you're wounded you can't be damaged any further. And of course, with healing effects not being allowed to be played in combat, it would normally never be possible to assign damage more than once to a unit. With resistance, however, as we said, a unit can soak up damage and go unwounded. And when you can do it, that's great. It's really great. But it doesn't mean that the unit can then be used to soak up damage again. So imagine maybe you're facing 3 enemies during a city assault, and maybe in a situation like that you might even have all 3 enemies all have an attack that one of your units could resist without taking any wounds. Just having that unit means basically those 3 enemies can never hurt anybody on your side under any circumstances if you allow that unit to take damage more than once. So you can see how potentially game-breaking resistance could be in a situation like that. And it's for that reason that they instituted that rule. You once you assign damage to a unit, whether it takes a wound or not, that's the only time you can assign damage to that unit during the course of a combat. So as promised, let's run through a quick example or two here, just to get the mechanics down absolutely airtight. Let's start with this simple guy here. He's got a damage of 4 on a straight up physical attack. If you were to apply that damage to the fire mages, although they have fire resistance, they do not have physical resistance, and therefore they're not resistant to that attack. So they would take a wound. They would deplete that 4 attack by the value of their armor, which is 4, and therefore they would take that wound and absorb all the damage. Toot sweet. If you instead assign that damage to the heroes here, they're physically resistant, which means that the first 3 points of physical damage are soaked up by them, but they don't take any wounds. So this guy would have his attack reduced all the way down to 1, and they haven't been hurt yet. However, any attack that continues is going to continue to affect this unit, and therefore that 1 extra point of damage will in fact wind up wounding this unit. So they would still, just like the fire mages at the end of the day, wind up taking 1 point of damage. However, you'll notice it's a 4 that outstrips their armor value of 3, yet they have managed to absorb all of the damage that this enemy has been able to inflict. Similarly, if you have a fire dragon like this and you attack the fire mages, then its first 4 points are going to be absorbed, doing nothing to the fire mages, but the damage will continue to hit the fire mages, and the next 4 points of damage are also going to be absorbed by the fire mages, then wounding them. You would have then 1 point of fire damage left that you could maybe send to the Delphana Masters, doing nothing to them, but of course precluding you from assigning any more damage to them. Or maybe you just take that wound yourself, depending on the situation. It would be up to you. If you had somebody like this, you're going to deal with each of their attacks separately. So maybe that first 4 points works basically just like this enemy. So perhaps you send it to the heroes, they absorb all of it. And then maybe that second 2, that fire damage, it could be sent to the fire mages or the Delphana Masters, because again, even though they have physical and ice resistance, the only thing that's relevant is that they do have fire resistance. So either of them is going to work mechanically just fine to absorb all of that, taking no damage. Finally, if you have something like these mages here with a cold fire attack and the brutal quality, they're going to get ugly pretty quick. First of all, as an elemental attack, physical resistance means nothing. So if you were to take that damage and apply it to the heroes, first of all, they are going to have the brutal effect. Therefore, they're doing 8 points of damage. These people are going to absorb only 3 of that. They're going to take a wound, using up only 3 of those 8 points, and you still have 5 left to reckon with. So you probably wouldn't even want to send it to the heroes unless you were really up a creek. Suppose you were to send it against the fire mages. Well, although fire is a component of the cold fire effect, just as when you're attacking an enemy that has both fire and ice resistance, and you're using one or the other or both, you're kind of hosed. If your attack here has both fire and ice, the fire mages, in order to resist it, would have to have both fire and ice resistances. Therefore, it is not treated as resistant to this attack. And again, just as the heroes, they're going to soak up 4 of the 8, take a wound, and then you have 4 left to reckon with. If, by contrast, you send it to the Delphana Masters, who do have both fire and ice resistance, they're again going to take the first 3 points, doing no damage, but then they're going to take another 3 points, taking a wound, and now, while you have wounded your Delphana Masters, which might not be the best thing in the world, this attack is at least reduced down to 2, because their armor was effectively doubled. And that's pretty much how resistance works for units. When a unit takes damage from a poison effect, just as with swiftness, first of all, because the damage rating is not changed by the poison quality, the mechanics of the actual wounding and the damage reduction effects that take place and all of that are actually going to be no different when an attack is poisonous. However, as we will see in a moment with paralysis effects, once a unit does in fact take damage from such an attack, an additional effect will then accrue. Namely, instead of taking 1 wound onto their card, they're going to take 2. This has no bearing at all on anything, except that they are now twice as hard to heal, and therefore twice as hard to get back into service. That's pretty much it. Of course, if after sending damage to a unit from a poison attack, there is still damage left, that remaining damage is still poisonous as well, and so any other unit that absorbs it will also take those extra wounds, as would you, placing your extras into your discard pile just as before. Think of this as a poison drink, and anybody taking a sip is going to get whacked. Paralysis is actually nice and simple to explain when it comes to units. They die. They're gone. End of story. If you send a paralyzing attack against a unit, if it would otherwise take a wound, you just throw it away instead, and that's all there is to it. Remember, of course, that this only takes place if the unit would be wounded. So it is possible to have a unit absorb a paralyzing attack and not be destroyed, if it was sufficiently resistant to reduce the attack to 0 with the first pass through its armor. Again, though, this would still require you to assign no further damage to that unit for the rest of the combat in question. So for instance, if we had the freezers here, and we were to send their damage against either the heroes or the fire mages, they would be doing damage to those targets, and as a result, either one of those targets would be completely destroyed, not merely wounded, but you would actually have to remove the card from the game as a result. They would still reduce the attack. So for instance, the freezers only have 3 points of damage. The paralysis doesn't change that. The swiftness doesn't change that. So they're only doing 3 points of damage. It's just that they paralyze whenever damage is inflicted. So if you send that against the heroes, that attack is still reduced to 3. It's still used up, as it were, in taking out the heroes, but you do lose the heroes forever. Same thing with the fire mages. The fire resistance doesn't help you against an ice attack. Even though their armor is not used up, they're getting hit, they're taking damage, therefore they're destroyed. By contrast, if you play this guy and send the damage against the Delphana Masters, who have 3 points of armor and have ice resistance, that ice resistance allows them to use up those 3 points of damage without taking any damage themselves, and therefore as a result they would not be destroyed by the paralysis. None of these units, however, would survive against the Medusa, because all of them would wind up taking damage. Even the ones that have physical resistance, they only have 3 points of armor, and therefore only the first 3 points of damage from the Medusa would be used up without inflicting damage. So both the heroes and the Delphana Masters would be destroyed by the Medusa, although again they would fully exhaust that attack and you wouldn't have to send any additional damage to anyone else. By contrast, against the fire mages, only 4 of those points of damage would be used up, and therefore the 2 additional points would have to go somewhere else, and you would still have to reckon with the paralyzing effects of those 2 points of damage even after you have destroyed your fire mages. The last quality of attacks that we need to discuss is the assassin quality. This too is actually very easy to explain. It's indicated by the little kind of bloody dagger symbol. And what this basically does is it says that the attack in question cannot be sent to damage units. Units can be used to block. You can use any means you want to block it. But when you're assigning damage from an attack with the assassin quality, units can never be used as meat shields. It's never going to interact with your units. It's all just going to come straight to you, and you would reckon with it just as you would anything else. So if you're dealing with this little unit right here, you're just taking those 4 points of damage straight to yourself, and there's nothing really else going on with it. If you're dealing with, again, the Delphana Masters here, you've got to reckon with the fact that it's coming to you. You can't send it against a unit. It's doing only 5 points of damage, but it is paralyzing. So that might be one that, as hard as it is to block, you might want to consider blocking, because you're going to lose any cards that you have in your hand, and that can often be a really bad thing. We've touched on this in a few places now, but now that we've covered all the ways in which units can get wounded or destroyed, let's talk briefly all in one place about getting the non-destroyed ones back on the firing line. A unit can only be activated, by which I mean played to take advantage of one of the powers on the card, if it is both ready and unwounded. This is also called spending the unit. Once you activate or spend a unit, it is then categorized as spent, and this means it is no longer usable until it is refreshed. Usually this happens at the start of the next round when all players' units are all refreshed. It can, though, still be used to take damage despite being spent, in which case it is, at least usually, now going to be both wounded and spent. These two things operate sort of independently of one another, so a unit is going to retain its ready or spent status independently of its wound status, and can be wounded independently of its spent or refreshed status. So it's also going to be refreshed and ready at the start of your next round, even if wounded, but it's going to remain wounded. The refreshing doesn't get rid of the wound. So because of that, you will still not be able to activate or spend it. And then if you heal a spent and wounded unit, all you've done is remove the wound, but you will not thereby have changed its spent status, and again you still not will be able to use that unit until you've also refreshed it. Again, to remove a wound from a unit, you need healing equal to the unit's level. So a level 4 unit like the Delphana Masters is rather difficult to heal for even a single wound, much less if they've taken 2 because of poison. And as such, you should probably be pretty reluctant to have them take damage for you at times. As much as it stinks to take wounds yourself, consider a scenario like the following. Suppose you have a hit coming at you that's going to do maybe 9 points of damage, and it's therefore going to generate, in this case, 3 wounds to you. You might think, I don't want that to happen. But if maybe you only have 1 unit available, maybe these are all wounded already, you might send that damage to the Delphana Masters, and they might absorb 6 of it thanks to their resistances. So as a result, you might have 1 wound come to you, and then you add another wound to the Delphana Masters, and you're like, oh, okay, that's great. I only took 1 wound myself, thanks. However, after that battle, if you have something like the Tranquility card available to you, those 2 points of healing that you can get, even when you're powering it up, that's all you're going to be able to get is just 2 points of healing. That's not enough to save the Delphana Masters. You need to find another 2 points of healing to get a total of 4. That's not always all that easy to come through. You can see you have to spend a level 3 unit with a mana to generate 4 points of healing. Not always easy to get that many points of healing in one spot. By contrast, if you instead had taken those 3 wounds into your hand yourself, well, you could spend 2 points of healing to just take 2 of those and chuck them. Now you're a whole lot better off because your Delphana Masters are still around, they're ready for action, they're ready to rock and roll. So you want to be careful about assigning damage to units in the first place, because again, they can be really hard to heal. And a unit that's level 4, even taking a single wound, much less taking 2, a lot of times it's going to stay wounded for a real long time. Similarly, Glades allow you to throw away wounds from your hand or from your discard pile, but not wounds from your units. So there's never going to be any question about how many points of healing a Glade is worth. It's actually only sort of healing anyway, and it's best not thought of in terms of points of healing because of this confusion. All it does is it removes a wound from you, whether it's in your hand or your discard pile. It doesn't give you healing points to spend, so there's really never going to be a question of how to spend them on units. Interactions, of course, by contrast, can give you healing points. and these can be combined with points from healing cards or skills to give you your best shot at healing units of high levels. That said, if you can interact in order to generate that much healing in the first place, then you're going to have a fair bit of influence to spend, and that means there's a chance you will have a better option for using those influence points, namely recruiting a replacement unit for a wounded unit instead of healing it. After all, this might get you a stronger unit, one better suited to your current needs, or simply just cost you less than healing the original unit. Additionally, you may have a keep nearby or a mage tower, which allow recruiting, but not necessarily have access to a village or a monastery, which are the only locales that really allow you to buy heal. So there are going to be lots of situations where just getting yourself a replacement is actually going to be the best way to go. So just to kind of put some flesh on those bones there, in a village you can spend 3 points of influence in order to generate 1 point of heal. So if, for instance, Tovak here saunters into this village, he's got a wounded unit in tow, well, that wound is going to take 3 points of healing in order to get rid of it. So that, if all I'm doing is buying points of healing from that village, that's going to require me to spend 9 influence in order to get rid of that wound. By contrast, these heroes here are also going to cost 9 points of influence. And my reputation might be benefiting me that much more in recruiting them than it would be in buying the healing from the village in the first place. So you can see, even at this situation, I could just basically be faced with a choice. Do I want to heal this guy, or do I want to just recruit this guy here? Well, it's going to be that much better as an option if, for instance, on top of being wounded, this unit here is also spent. Because when that unit is recruited, it comes to me not only unwounded, but unspent and refreshed. So it's actually fully available to me. Moreover, I might find that, for instance, this guy's ranged attack is something that I want for something that I have planned going on. Or perhaps this was, instead of a level 3 unit, perhaps I had a level 4 unit. Now, recruiting a level 3 replacement might be a bit of a downgrade, but if I have no option, because I don't have enough influence to generate 12 influence, which would be what I would need in order to get 4 points of healing in order to heal a wounded unit, or God help me if one of these units was poisoned and had double wounds on it, well then very definitely I'm going to start considering taking a replacement unit instead. The way this works in practice is as follows. First, you need to bear in mind that anytime you recruit a unit, you have to have a command token to put it under. If you have an open space, cool. All you have to do is put the new unit there, and then worry about finding additional spots later on. So if I have a command token over here, I can go ahead and just throw that guy in there into the empty spot. But what if I don't? Well, if you don't have a free spot, you can still recruit by simply replacing any unit that you have with the new one. This is called disbanding, but it doesn't actually, like the way it's described in the manual in a number of places, you kind of half wonder, does it require an action? Do I need to play a card? Because they refer to it with this fancy title, you must disband the unit. But nowhere in any of the manuals does it actually give a description or state that it requires an action or any kind of play or turn, any kind of moment in the turn when you have to be announcing that you're disbanding. As far as I can figure, just looking at the manual, it just kind of comes for free. Whenever you recruit a unit, you have the option of just throwing it into the spot that was previously occupied by another unit, and this is just called disbanding the other unit, which is then taken and removed from the game. it doesn't actually therefore cost you anything in terms of actions or points on top of what it cost you to recruit the unit in the first place. It just sort of comes for free with the recruitment. Importantly, the list of units that you can replace with new recruits includes units that are spent, wounded, or even both spent and wounded. The new unit comes to you unwounded and ready, as we've said, no matter the status of the unit that you swapped it for. That is, in classic Mage Knight fashion, you're going to be potentially using up some nice friends and then kicking them to the curb the instant it becomes more convenient for you to do so than to heal them. And this actually often is the case. This means that potentially you could have something like 3 or 4 command tokens and wind up using 4, 5, even 6 units during the course of a single day or night without ever healing or refreshing a single one of them. Of course, usually you're not going to be cycling through quite that many men, if only because you're only going to have so much influence available to you. There's only going to be so many units in the offer and only so many places to get them. But it's in principle possible, especially after tackling some of the cities where you're going to be allowed to recruit a number of units and you've probably just wounded and spent a whole bunch of others. So in a situation like this, I have an influence card. I've got a crystal. That's going to give me 4 influence. Let's set aside reputation considerations, but I do have influence 5 from my heroes here. So I could spend that unit, combine it with this, and get the 9 that I need to recruit those heroes. I could then put them in place of any of the 3 units that I have here, and of course all 3 of them are now spent. Let's assume that I replace it. I'm going to wind up replacing the unit that not only is spent but also is wounded. That unit then comes to me unwounded and unspent and available for me to use immediately. And that's pretty much all there is to it. And that's it. That's damage in a nutshell. And actually with that, we've managed now to cover the whole core of combat in Mage Knight. There's really not a whole lot left to combat that needs to be covered, although I do plan to release at least another 2 videos in this series. The next one will be covering the intricacies of grouping enemies together for attack. And then I thought I might try my hand at a bit of a mini playthrough, maybe including a city assault, just to demonstrate how big combats go and how all of these different facets come together all at once. But that really is the core of combat in Mage Knight. We've covered really all the big topics. I tried to keep this interesting not only for novice players, although that's my primary intended audience, but I hope that people with a few games under their belts got something out of it as well. If not just entertainment, then hopefully I clarified maybe a couple of rules that maybe they missed or overlooked or misinterpreted or weren't 100% confident. I'm reasonably confident with the correction that I've put down for knockouts, that everything else in these videos is pretty accurate. But of course I welcome any corrections at all in the comments so that everybody can get crystal clear on all of this. That's really the motivating factor here anyway. But that's really all I got for now. I will see you next time with the grouping enemies video. Until then, please like, share, and subscribe if you're so inclined, and good hunting, Mage Knights.